Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the seventh lecture of the second edition of Professor Rajani Prasanna Endowment Lecture Series on Climate Change and Public Health. This lecture series continues to honor the vision of Professor Rajani Prasanna, whose dedication towards climate awareness, public health, and societal engagement has created an important platform for dialogue and learning. Over the course of this lecture series, we have explored how climate change intersects with public health, governance, technology, and communities. Today's session brings together another critical dimension, which is the relationship between climate justice, disaster preparedness, and community resilience. As climate events become more intense and frequent, conversations have expanded from environmental degradation to how societies prepare for risks, respond to disasters, and rebuild communities in an equitable and sustainable way. Environmental justice, disaster mitigation, legal guidelines, and post disaster rehabilitation have become central to public health and development. Today's session approaches climate change from multiple perspectives, from risk prevention and mitigation to how communities respond through rebuilding efforts following the tsunami in 2004, and finally to the whole of courts and policy frameworks in shaping global climate accountability. We are privileged to have with us distinguished speakers and experts who bring rich academic, professional, and field experience to this discussion. I will now move forward to formally introducing our speaker for today's session. To invite Professor Durganand Balsavan, who has been working with the Tata Trust Foundations addressing climate changes. He's also an architect by nature, and his topic is on the intersection of environmental advocacy, habitat, and community. Lastly, but not the least, we have architect on board and we have a civil engineering on board addressing the risk, who else to address the challenges on the diplomacy and policy aspect to understand the gaps and what affects it. Nonetheless, I'd like to firstly give a short introduction to Professor Archana Negi. Professor Archana Negi teaches at the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament at the School of International Studies at JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Her research interests relate to diplomacy and international organization, with a focus on aspects of international trade and environmental diplomacy. Outside of JNU, Professor Negi lectures at several prestigious institutions across the country. She is a member of the International Scientific Advisory Board of the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, located in Bonn, Germany. She is also a member of the Voluntary Standards of Sustainability Academic Advisory Council, set up jointly by the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards and the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies of the University of Leuven. She is currently on the editorial board of the Indian Journal of International Law and International Studies. Furthermore, going on and moving ahead, now, furthermore, and moving on ahead, upon introduction of, after introducing Professor Archana Negi, I'd like to introduce our upcoming next speaker, Professor Durganand Balsavar. Professor Durganand Balsavar. He founded the ARTIS Roots Collaborative, an interdisciplinary forum of research praxis. Over the last 3 decades, Dr. Balsavar has been involved in academia, urban policy, community self-built, environment, climate and disaster mitigation, affordable housing, institutional and education, war refugees, indigenous practices, and habitat studies. Dr. Balsavar has been on national and international juries, including Ambassador of RIBA International Awards jury, IIA, IIT Gandhinagar, and he reviews at the Sci Arc Los Angeles. Party's roots features in the 20 best practices, Building Wise by CSE. The community participatory Nagapattinam tsunami, self-built, rebuilding, climate change, war refugees, and urban design initiatives have been recognized as best practices by the United Nations Development Programme. As an invited member of the Chennai Master Plan Monitoring Committee, AMB Barcelona, post United Nations Habitat 3 in 2018, being part of the Berlin Climate Policy 2050, is chaired at the Cambridge UK VIT Future Cities Summit 2018. Dr. Balsavar also co-founded the Jaipur Architecture Festival, Confluence 10, and COA Reads Forum. Writing for national and international journals and research, Dr. Balsavar is a senior advocate advisor to the United Nations Environment Programme based in Tamil Nadu. Dr. Balsavar works at the intersections of environment, habitat, and community in advocacy, policy, research, and practices. Dr. Balsavar has authored several books and is an invited writer for the Hindu Scroll, Domus International, and several other journals and publications. Last but not the least, again, we have Dr. Balsavar and Dr. Archana Negi on board. So right now, begin introducing you to our upcoming speaker, Professor Dr. N. Krishnamurthy, sir. Sorry about the camera. Professor Krishnamurthy, sir, also known as Professor Krishna, was born in Bangalore in 1931. He did his BSc and BE Civil in India and his MSc CE and PhD in USA. He has 67 years of teaching, training, research, and consultancy experiences in India, USA, and Singapore on structural engineering, computer applications, and workplace safety and risk management. He has investigated accidents as a forensic engineer and testified as expert witness in some of them. He has published 7 technical books on his own, 3 co-authored books, and over 120 technical papers, and has patented 3 inventions. A book by him on working safety at heights and another on methods of hazard analysis have recently been released by CRC Press. He is a member of National Code Framing Committee in Singapore and India. He was founder president of the Singapore Structural Steel Society and the Singapore chapter of ASCE, along with being a founding director of Vidyaranya Academy of Computing and Center for Workplace Safety and Health at Mysore. He remains an Indian citizen, currently living in Singapore as a safety consultant and trainer. Now, I hand over today's platform to Professor Krishnamurthy, sir, as the first speaker of our Professor Rajani Prasanna Endowment Lecture Series. Now, if I may, I'd like to say that requesting you that as we reach the end of today's session, I request our participants, especially our student participants, to please refrain and ask your questions in the chat session, as we have few of our enlightened dignitaries and family asking some of the main questions. Thank you, sir. Over to you, sir. You may please feel free to share your screen as it fits.
Thank you, Rahul. Thank you for the introduction. So, first of all, my thanks to Mahe to have invited me. And I'm particularly proud that my former student and present, I may say, colleague and friend, Prasanna, and now his wife, Professor Rajani, are connected with this. And it's a great privilege to be speaking as a speaker in the Endowment Lecture Series, especially in the title, Risk Prevention and Mitigation for Climate Change. During an earlier introduction, Rahul said I may be focusing on civil engineering, but I hope you are not too disappointed, because that would be a very narrow area, but I found that the method I'm going to talk about in risk management will apply across the board for a wider topic. So I'm going to cover it in a wider manner. And this is, in particular, I would like you to remember my website where you can get a lot more details of my work and free papers and so on and so forth. So what is risk management? I'm sure many of you know, but today I'm going to focus on one particular technique. We have mishaps, accidents, incidents, problems, crises, and there are many causes that contribute to it. And once the mishap happens, it also diverges into many consequences. Most of them are today predictable, except that climate change is a sudden shocker for most of us. Some have not even accepted the reality of it, but all the participants today and speakers today know full well that it's a very great reality. The shape of the graphics appears to be a bow tie. So it's called the bow tie method. And it also, some viewed a butterfly in it. And so it's a butterfly method, but it's better known, more commonly known as the bow tie method of risk analysis. Now, the problem is we have enough information on causes and consequences, but we as professionals do not sit back. We contributed to the problem, so we must now do something about the solution. So we try to provide safeguards so that the causes may be prevented from causing the mishap to the extent we can. Those are called preventive barriers, and they decrease the likelihood of a mishap happening. But in spite of our best efforts, mishaps do happen. And so we have to interpolate or interrupt with other safeguards which can reduce the impact on the people, the property, and the environment. And those are called mitigative barriers. So this is the general scheme of bow tie method of risk management. It's not unique. It's a combination of many other existing methods. And I'm going to cover 5 topics today, given the time. It can be 10 or 15, but 5 are good enough. The same method can be applied to the other remaining topics. Climate change has resulted in extreme heat waves. Over a 140-year period, for the first 60 or 70 years, it was less than the average in most habited places. But about 60 years from the 1940s, temperatures have risen to the extent that the extrapolation is really frightening. The other evidences of the effect of heat waves is that the glaciers have melted and the North Pole has decreased in size by the amount of the red colored area shown in the second sketch. And these are all facts which are not, we cannot argue about. Then over a 22-year period, the sea levels have been rising, obviously because the ice caps have melted, and the water has increased the level to the extent that in the future, already much of the coastline in many countries have been eroded and occupied by the ocean. And some islands have already requested the UN for an equivalent area because in about a few decades, they will be submerged. So that is the general effect. Then, of course, flooding is a consequence of this. And flooding has occurred in many parts of the world, regardless of whether they're the first world or the second world or the third world. Nature doesn't care about education, wealth, or any other topic. We are all in it. We must all share we have caused the problem together. We must share in the solution together. So along with flooding on the one hand, the other extreme is drought, and that has hurt a lot of populations. And then, of course, the climate change involves many storms and cyclones, which have increased in frequency and intensity. And last but not least, in my today's presentation would be vector-borne diseases. The word vector, I'm sure all of you know, applies apart from the graphical or the geometrical explanation, it also applies to living things that can cause problems to humans. Anything from lice to mosquitoes to rats and so on. So that will be my general coverage. And elegant and logical way to solve such a gigantic crisis of global climate change is by risk management. I will not make a tutorial of this. It means first you identify whatever problems we have, whatever mishaps occur, try to understand, get a handle on them, then do a likelihood assessment. What are the chances it will happen at a particular time in a particular region? Then, if and when it happens, how bad is it? Is it very severe? Is it just a scratch or a fracture or some environmental effect and so on? We can assess them today qualitatively and quantitatively. And combining these two major contributors to risk, we can categorize the risk generally as low risk, which we accept as part of living everyday life, to high risk, which we do not want under any circumstances, and in between the low and high is a lot of medium risk, which we as technical people and as administrators, we must manage, and we do manage. Today's rest of the talk will talk about one method. And of course, the technical people call it treatment of the risk, as just like a doctor, once he has diagnosed a disease, he treats it. We know the problem, we treat it. It's also called risk control. Now, it's usually how do we manage or control the risk? Before the mishap happens, just like grandma said, uh, uh, prevention is better than cure. So we want to reduce the likelihood chances of occurrence. So that is one portion. But it happens in many cases in a reduced intensity or frequency, and we can manage that to reduce the impact of it, which is called mitigative barriers, and that reduces the severity. The basic approach, therefore, will be to document and qualitatively analyze the various causes that would converge and the different consequences that would diverge from the mishap, and then determine the preventive and mitigative barriers. Of course, if they can be quantified, then we get a handle on how much percent and other measures of how to control them. So this is the bow tie outline. And I'm going to take an example which many people can relate to, COVID hospitalization. And it has many causes. I'm just choosing 4 of them: infection, droplets in the air, droplets during oral communication, sneezing, and so on, airborne particles, and physical contact. And in the consequences, there are many more, of course, and they all interact. In the physical consequences, I'm just taking 3: hypoxia, lack of oxygen, and then maybe in some cases, I know Mr. Prasanna has done a lot to alleviate that. There was a reduction in the availability of oxygen generators. And then some treatments, occasionally it's too late when they join, it's also failing. And then finally, there is a relapse. So we will have to think of how to overcome or prevent them. I've shown only 4. Again, in this simplified case, each cause I have shown one preventive barrier, but it's not necessary. One preventive barrier can affect many causes, and one cause may need more than one preventive barrier. But to keep it simple, I have shown corona vaccines, surgical mask, social distancing, hand washing. And then on the consequences side, again, I've shown only 3 mitigative barriers. There could be more. And those are full isolation and hospital treatment and oxygen generator availability. So this is a general outline. Now, I was able to get statistics because I myself, my wife and I had it twice, and I spent the quarantine time in collecting data. So to keep it simple, I'm showing full numbers. So these are the rough numbers, of failure of lack of effectiveness of these 4 safeguards, and they add up to 18%, which will have to be, if we don't control it by mitigative barriers, it will be 18% who are left unprotected. So again, statistics, again, these are may not be the right numbers, but I'm taking simple round numbers for the three safeguards, mitigative barriers. So these are the percentages from the hospitalization number. So fatality rate is 6%, 3 plus 2 plus 1 times 18, that is 1.1%. So this fits well with the experience world average of fatalities. Now, I can say so much more, but without sounding like a salesman, I'm just going to refer you to my website for a book which explains this method and many other methods. Thank you. So, just like it was mentioned in the introduction, there have been recent reports of heat-related mortality, wild smoke-derived particulate-related deaths, air pollution related 7.9 million deaths, and heat exposure reduction in labor hours and productivity losses of 1.09 trillion USD. So all these are facts, and so it is time. Already the series have invested a lot of expertise into this. So today I hope my modest contribution adds a little bit more to that. So quickly, now without taking too much time, I'll be rushing through this, but you will be receiving a copy of the slides. So the first one, extreme height waves. These are the three causes I have chosen. Only three I am limiting myself, and three consequences. And the second one, flooding, three causes. I won't read them. Sea level rise, you can read them and absorb them mentally faster than I can read them. And in the consequences, infrastructure damage, population displacement, and so on. And these pictures are very graphic. And it's not just third world countries. Nature, as I said, does not discriminate. It has happened in the US and other first world countries also. The drought, on the other extreme, has also been hurting us. Many countries have had to ration their waters and have had to import foods which were being produced. The causes: reduced rainfall, high evaporation due to extra heat, climate variability, and the consequences: crop failures, water scarcity, and so on. And the fourth one, storms and cyclones, warm temperatures, atmospheric instability, intensified moisture cycles, and the consequences: storm surges, power outages, structural damage. This is my little area of structures. But the problem is much bigger than that. Last, vector-borne diseases. This was a poster done in a school competition. It only shows mosquitoes. Singapore incidentally let loose a breed of male mosquitoes into the mosquito population, and those mosquitoes are infertile, so the females would not be able to reproduce. So that is their one way of controlling the mosquito problems. Again, vector-borne, warmer climate increasing the vectors, increase promoting breeding, shifting ranges, increase in ranges area, more places, and the consequences: increased disease incidence, healthcare system strain, spread to new regions. So these are the causes and consequences. Now, quickly, the five preventive and mitigative barriers. So again, I won't read all of them. You will get a copy of the slides, and by just looking at it, I think I've made it bold enough to make it impact on your mind and remain there. The preventive barriers include urban greening, reflective and color roofs, and heat resilient city planning. The mitigative barriers include cooling centers, heat alert, emergency medical response. Again, I keep repeating, this is a very simplified process, just for demonstration. In flooding, we have seen the causes and consequences. The preventive barriers are floodplain zoning, wetland protection, and drainage upgrades. The mitigative barriers are evacuation plans. People have had to evacuate, and temporary flood barriers, emergency shelters, and so on. Drought, again, we remember the causes and consequences. preventive barriers, drought resistant crops, water storage. Your neck may get a strain reading them, but can't help it. Efficient irrigation, and on the mitigative barriers, crop insurance, water rationing protocols. Already it has come. Australia stopped watering lawns last year, emergency water supply, and so on. And fourth, storms and cyclones, early warning systems, coastal buffers, strong building codes. They have all to be revised now, the building codes. Emergency power systems for mitigation, shelters, and post storm recovery plans. Last but not least, the vector borne diseases. Those will load the hospitals. Preventive barriers include public health education, vector control, as the example I gave of infertile males let into the population, sanitation improvements, and that I think some countries need very badly, medical treatment capacity increase, disease surveillance, and rapid outbreak response. All these are in place already. We will have to work at them rather in an accelerated fashion to slow down the problem and also improve life to the future generation. So, as I already mentioned, some of my disclaimers, this is the simple demonstration and it has not covered the entire field. It cannot do it. It's a whole course, probably. I'll be happy to give a course in it. I've shown 3 of every item. There could be more. And I've already said one cause may require more than one barrier, and one barrier may require more than one cause. And similarly, one consequence may require one barrier, and consequences also need more barriers. Furthermore, safety barriers by themselves may introduce other hazards, so we'll have to cycle them again. And this is best done not by a single expert, but by a pool of brains in brainstorming by experts. They come up with suggestions, and that is how we extract the best from our available knowledge. And as I said, we can quantify them with, and I have spent a whole chapter on giving quantification because eventually we can do all the talking, but the people who do things want to know how much, where, and how to do them. So, with that, I think I have remained within my time limit. Thank you for your attention, and whether it is now or later, I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful lecture. I think you have covered a lot more on the risks that we see during heat and effects that are commonly visible in heat islands. What happens when there is improper planning of urban, for example, increase in vector-borne diseases such as dengue and malaria, which are quite important to India. So yes, there's always cause and effect. And who else to better explain now in continuation with Dr. Durganand Balsavar sir on his topic, intersection of environmental advocacy, habitat and community, rebuilding Nagapattinam post-tsunami 2004. Today's presentation by Dr. Durganand Balsavar re-examines a specific project, a complex rebuilding process in the context of tsunami disaster. Over the last 2 decades, the prospect of climate change has resulted in several natural disasters like tsunami, earthquakes, floods, cyclones, and more. What we recently saw, apart from the tsunami, was also the landslide in Kerala. Dr. Balsavar's praxis evolved at the intersection of sustainable habitat planning, environment, and community participation. The process has involved research, advocacy, formulating policy, and praxis to validate empirical research. The rapidity of urban growth generates new challenges that invite an interdisciplinary approach. I now hand over this platform to Dr. Durganand Balsavar. Over to you, sir.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Rahul, and honor to be part of the Endowment lecture series with Dr. Krishnamurthy Archana, Negi, Swati, and others. This presentation I'll make very brief. It's more to do with the intersections of habitat, environment, and community in the rebuilding of Nagapattinam. Health, in a sense, is by implication because we're looking at what is sustainable urban planning, what is thermal comfort, how do you relate to nature. So, health comes by implication, and this is more a practitioner's view in of urban design and urban planning and rebuilding after a disaster. Briefly, since Dr. Swati had requested to give a brief on what Artis is about. So we are a collective and we were founded in now 1990 and we have four verticals. One is research, policy, advocacy and praxis and working in three areas of environment, habitat and community. Some of the earlier projects have been the tsunami rebuilding or the entire Nagapattinam actually and funded by largely by the Tata Trust. Then there has been the rural school rebuilding from CI, funded by CII, village knowledge centers with Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, alternative and indigenous building crafts that we have a few rural schools, the nature-based solutions, urban planning. We've been working on the Chennai master plan. And when the Sri Lankan war broke out, we were in the rehabilitation of war refugees and then natural disasters like in Kerala and the Chennai flood as well of 2015. Let's look at one. I think Dr. Krishnamurthy's presentation was very evocative in the sense that it gave a insightful presentation on what is risk, how does one mitigate it. So I won't get into those processes. I'll get more into the like a practitioner's view of the Nagapattinam tsunami, which was caused by a massive undersea earthquake near Sumatra and which affected places like Nagapattinam, Kadalur, and Kanyakumari. Our projects were across the coast and also in Andaman. But for this presentation, I'm focusing only on Akkarepete and Nagapattinam and some areas north of it. It also looks at what was the rehabilitation policy from a livelihood restoration point and housing, as well as certain reforms in environmental conservation guidelines, largely coming from strengthening coastal regulation zones. From an impact, we are all aware that there was a massive loss of homes, boats and nets, many other ancillary um, amenities. Entire village economies collapsed. And so it was not only physical, it was a socio-economic and psychological impact as well. There was ecosystem damage, and there Dr. M.S. Swaminathan was heading it, and we were kind of collaborating with them on rebuilding village knowledge centers and other amenities, regeneration of mangroves, a re-examination of the value of sand dunes and coastal vegetation. So in a sense, it highlighted the protective role of ecosystems. And we know there was a collapse of basic infrastructure. The first phase was really involved in large-scale emergency responses. So that was a whole, and I've not included that in my presentation. It would be too long. But it was largely to do with transitionary shelters till the permanent housing and was built because it takes about 2 or 3 years to build permanent housing back, roads, schools, something built over centuries. A tsunami can take, destroy in a matter of minutes or hours. And so that's the fury or power of nature. And in our presentation, in our work now over the last 30 years, we realized that most often nature actually provides its own safeguards. And I'll come to that later. And that if our urban planning and the manner in which human inhabitation happens, whether it's in respect to health, environment, um, materials, local resources, and if built sustainably, then most often nature provides the protection. So in this housing reconstruction, and this is we were involved also in Latur and Gujarat, and in when we were involved in Latur and the Gujarat earthquake 25 years ago, we realized that there was a methodology of doing standardized designs, most of them top down approach, designed elsewhere and then placed or rather imposed on the environment here. And they often were poorly adapting to the local lifestyle. So, in contrast, what we decided here, and we were supported by the Tata Trust, is to start a bottom up approach where we engage, collaborate with community in design, local resource, and till land is identified and the processes, legal processes happen, there is generally a period of 6 to 8 months. So it actually gives that agency and time to work with communities to understand the needs of the settlement. So one was the relocation. The first knee-jerk response is often to move the settlements deep into the hinterland. But if that was happening, the fishing community would lose its access to the sea. So that was one challenge. There was this quite considerable disruption of livelihood. And so it was always a safety versus livelihood kind of an issue that we were handling in the urban planning of the new settlement, which had to rise. Then the participatory approach brought in, we realized a greater sense of belonging, social acceptance, and deeper resilience because now the community was equipped. It's not a third party contractor coming, building, and going away. The community was involved within the building process. This is the reconstruction, so a people's process. Broad idea. This single project was about 760 homes, but in I think consolidated there were almost 15,000 homes built over that period, with training capacity given to 30 villages of different scales. And there were other housings done with CII and many other groups. But the Tata Housing kind of was able to look at a more holistic approach, right from regeneration of nature-based solution, trees, solar, as well as the design principles on planning and thermal comfort. So we were able to engage in passive cooling, thermal comfort, orientation, along with a capacity building program, which means they were trained masons, carpenters, construction techniques, and rejuvenate the local skill. There was a strong participation of women, and we realized that um, a women driven approach was more conducive because for various reasons. And in the fishing community, it's almost a matriarchal system also where the women are uh, they show a certain sense of leadership, I would say innovation, compassion. So it turned slowly into a women driven approach. And I think which brought considerable balance to the project. And so women were involved in the planning, even the construction distance. And this has been, there are several, I've provided links so that I don't have to. And if someone requires, we'll post it also later. There's enough documented on these processes in Ekistics, in DOMIS, and the Center for Science and Environment has also done significant documentation of these processes. Um, the other was to use low cost, locally appropriate technology. And one decision we took was not to reinvent new technology, which is generally an urge, but kind of engage with uh, uh, several experts in the region, locally available technologies which may not have completely been adopted and then induced the adoption. So one was rat trap bond, filler slab, minimal lime plaster, and the outcome was that we could have a control on cost, better thermal comfort, easier maintenance, but most importantly, the community now had imbibed all the skills. It was not a third party contractors coming and working on it. So that was the whole idea. A brief comparison of a medieval town and a sustainable city, or what we were looking at, is that we found that the settlements that were there in Nagapattinam and around the coast had organically grown to be sustainable, what today is called the 15-minute city, where any amenity, so it was a mixed use, and any amenity was available in a 15 to 20-minute walk from the home. I think from a consequence of health, mobility, uh, and reduction of transport or the need for transport, this kind of urban planning, we hope, can be re-imbibed. Because when land uses are far and we have to travel 3 hours or 2 hours to a city, across the city, um, most of the traffic we find in a city today doesn't belong to the road at all. It is crossing to another portion, to another location in the city. And so we thought, let us re-examine the medieval fabric of Nagapattinam, of and also several other medieval towns like Ahmedabad, Srirangam, Madurai in Kerala. So we get medieval town footprints in different climatic zones and re-establish what we call the human scale design, where walking gets induced. Today, I think walking and cycling have become important aspects. Yeah, I'll go a little faster. And so the materials that we used, lime plaster, again, natural materials, rat trap bond, filler slab, and terracotta flooring. I think each of this, there's ample links on websites to understand this further. Now we come to how does nature really, the relationship to nature, and how does nature protect settlements? Now, if we look at earlier medieval, let's say 200 or 300 years ago, along the coast, first, they recognize the fragility of the relationship of land and the sea or the ocean. So there's no defined line. The line keeps changing between the low tide, high tide, and with the sea breeze, there is a certain lifting and formation of these dunes, including the vegetation. Now, we found in areas where the settlements and villages and towns had respected these natural boundaries and the dunes were protected, when the tsunami or cyclone hit those areas of the coast, the dunes were resilient and strong enough to absorb considerably the force of the water. Um, so when the government was asking us to build tsunami resistant houses or tsunami resistant homes, we had to kind of bring it on the table that tsunami resistant homes cannot be designed. And so that was the first um, kind of observation we had, that and structurally we cannot design a tsunami resistant home, and it needs to be absorbed by these natural forces. So that was one aspect of this, from which developed a re-understanding of the value of the CRZ and nature in relationship to the protection that nature provides us from these unpredictable forces. So this is pretty much the uh, shore area where you have a dune or you have landscape, and these are generally not valued. I find that even in the rebuilding now, there are many areas where after reconstruction, these dunes have again been either excavated or the vegetation is cut, and this force of urban speculation comes in contrast with environmental conservation. But in reality, I think there's a greater recognition now on the value of this to save or safeguard us from the adversity of nature, and which now is being quantified in terms of economic benefits or economic losses. Because in any disaster of this kind, the losses are immeasurable, and versus the land value which of ecological land that was destroyed for some township or some other development. So it's pretty much like this, where the dunes are lost. And I think there is a whole surge now in re-examining how building codes or CRZ or traditional practices can be brought back uh, to kind of balance this relationship between ecology and habitat. Briefly on the environmental advocacy that we've broadly been doing, one is value driven. So it's largely leading to the responsibility that is there towards nature. This is more generic, a little philosophical, but it is backed with it. I think it has value only if it is backed with science based. So there's a climate science and ecological research to show the evidence and data for it. And then at various levels, it could be at the level of a small neighborhood, a community, a region, a national level, or sometimes a comparison between different regions in the Southeast. Policy begins with advocacy for us, and the advocacy comes through several, uh, either it's documents or writing in the paper. I write very often in the paper, whenever in the newspapers, Hindu or in order to generate that kind of a conversation in civic society. And then the policy kind of, from those kind of advocacy conversations of multiple diverse views, that we look for generating the regulation, and then that converted to governance system. So at each of these, we work with the Tamil Nadu government. Either it's the forest department or it's a development CMDA development authority or the urban development to do this. So the rebuilding, in a sense, gave us insights into how the community participation, ecological sensitivity, and appropriate technology kind of synergize with socioeconomic realities. I'll run through this very fast. This is, I think, very repetitive. The model now shows that architecture is not merely about buildings, but enabling communities and people with their indigenous knowledge to evolve new systems to respond to nature together. These are two books. One is by CSE Delhi called Building Wise. It documents 20 practitioners, and we were honored to be in the book as one of the practitioners who have kind of looked at this relationship between community, environment, and habitat. And the other book is New Directions in Sustainable Design by Dr. Adrian Parr. Again, 20 practitioners from around the planet to look at how alternative solutions to sustainability, while keeping in mind the other challenges of land values, speculation, economies, community aspirations, can merge. There's an interdisciplinary team that I lead here, but I think it's more to do with a series of conversations with diverse groups. And then at times it can have a larger gestation period because you're uh, combining views. It's not a top-down approach where we design and do. It's much faster. But if I think we have conversation, understand multiple diverse views of different within the community, there can be a diversity of views. Then it's another. So thank you very much, and I think that's my presentation. If there are any questions later on, I would really be open to take them. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for your wonderful presentation. It gives us a lot more thoughts about architecture is not just about building planning, but also about the whole township. And across this, how can biodiversity, ecology merge with the township planning? This also gives us to the thought that now, as you rightly mentioned, with the economical impact and the socio-economic boom, especially with the tourism, we also see a lot of violation that occurs around the CRZ zone, and also loss of mangroves, which actually impacts the high tide, low tide, and also the filtration system. But however, now we'd like to proceed with the third and final speaker for this session before we have the question and answers. I hand over today's platform, first and final speaker, to Professor Dr. Archana Negi, who is a policy specialist to understand about the relationship, the dynamics of our country and where we stand. Over to you, madam.
Thank you, Rahul. A very good evening to everybody. And well, many thanks to the Prasanna School of Public Health for this invite to be part of the Professor Rajani Prasanna Endowment Lecture Series. I was fascinated to hear from Professor Krishnamurthy on climate risk and his model, and Professor Balsavar on post-disaster recovery. And I apologize from dragging the listeners away from the on-ground, situation which really matters to somewhere quite distant, which is the international law and diplomacy arena and what's happening out there. So I hope to add to the conversation on climate and health from the perspective of international law and diplomacy, drawing particularly from recent developments in climate litigation and what is happening in the courts. Of course, given that this is a short intervention, I will not cover the entire expanse of this, but try to maybe provide an overview. I will do this in two parts, talking first about the climate change health interface and then focusing on climate litigation. So let me start with the opening presumption that climate change and health are closely linked. I do not think anyone is going to have difficulty in accepting this linkage, that the consequences of swiftly and increasingly warming Earth are devastating to human health. Right. So the World Meteorological Organization, which the WMO, which is the authoritative quote unquote thermometer of the world, found in its State of the Global Climate Report of 2025 that the global annual average temperature for 2025 was approximately 1.43 degrees Celsius above the average during the period 1850 to 1900, which is traditionally used as a reference for what we call the pre-industrial period. So to put this 1.43 degrees Celsius figure in context, Article 2 of the 2015 Paris Agreement, which is currently the key international climate treaty that we have in place internationally, sets its main objectives as, and I quote from Article 2, limiting global average temperature increases to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and quote unquote again, pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So 1.5 is what the treaty mandates that we are supposed to pursue efforts to, and 1.43 has already been breached. The WMO report then goes on to confirm that 2015 to 2025 were the hottest 11 years on record, with climate-related extreme events, intense heat, heavy rainfall, tropical cyclones causing devastation around the world. The direct outcomes of climate change, which we've also talked about in the previous presentations, rising temperatures, changing rainfall patterns, poor air quality, water and food scarcity, etc., lead to greater spread of insect-borne diseases, what Professor Krishnamurthy also referred to as vector-borne diseases, and cause malnutrition, disease, respiratory problems, etc. And then there are, of course, linked fallouts such as extreme events, displacement, migration, which open up populations to health risks resulting from overcrowding, poor sanitation, etc. Also, impacts of climate change have negative effects on mental health, rise in psychiatric and mood disorders, depression, anxiety, and also a proven increase in incidences of suicide. So it is good to remember at this point that the constitution of the World Health Organization, the WHO, adopted way back in 1946, defines health expansively, and I quote from the WHO constitution as health being defined as, quote, a state of complete physical, mental, and social well being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So, this definition goes beyond a strictly medical perspective, focusing on avoiding disease and injury, to emphasizing a holistic, positive approach accounting for general well being. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the IPCC, which is the most authoritative international body for assessing the state of climate science, has also firmly established the link between climate change and human health. And I would direct you to Chapter 7 in its recent most assessment report, the 6th assessment report, or AR6, which highlights the increase in climate-related illnesses, premature deaths, malnutrition, threats to mental health and well-being, and the expected increase in extreme weather events, then leading further to what they call cascading and compounding risks affecting health. Now, from the perspective of climate justice and equity concerns, it needs pointing out that inequalities further exacerbate the climate-related health crises that disproportionately affect the marginalized communities. So there will be certain populations, such as the elderly, the children, those who are already suffering health conditions, who are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Also, low-income communities and indigenous populations may be disproportionately affected by climate change because of limited access to healthcare and greater exposure to climate-related health hazards. So, given these well-established linkages between climate change and health concerns, what have been the international legal responses to these challenges? Multilateral negotiations to address climate change have been taking place under the UNFCCC track, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, through a system of regular meetings for negotiating issues relating to climate change. The first COP, or Conference of Parties, COP1, took place in Berlin in 1995, and the latest COP, COP30, was held in Belém last year in Brazil. Now, the climate conferences have also begun to talk of the health interface, but in interestingly different ways. Let me give you the specific examples. COP26, which was held in Glasgow in 2021, brought human health to the climate negotiations, introducing the first health program. It was called the COP26 Health Program, bringing health into the UNFCCC negotiations. Now, when we talk of the climate change health interface, one facet of the interface is to do with the health implications of climate change. And this is understandably what receives the most attention. Also, what we focus more upon in our discussion here. But another way in which this interface or relationship works is the impact of public health systems on the climate. For instance, the National Health Service of the UK is responsible for around 4 to 5% of the UK's carbon emissions. Globally, the carbon impact of health systems is around the same, with emissions in the health system originating either from sources common to other larger organizations. For instance, there are large buildings, there are vehicles in use, etc., or from specific medical activities or devices like inhalers or anesthetics. So in Glasgow, led by the UK and the WHO, over 50 countries committed to building climate resilient and sustainable low carbon health systems, with many countries aiming for a net zero emissions target by 2050, and UK leading the charge with a net zero target of 2040 for its NHS. And this has further led to international cooperation that takes the form of something called the ATAC, the Alliance for Transformative Action on Climate Change and Health. COP28, which was held in Dubai in 2023, focused on health. In fact, this was called the Health COP. It was titled the Health COP, but the focus here was different. And the COP28 Declaration on Climate and Health, which was supported by 100 countries, basically sounded the alarm or focused more on the severe health implications of climate change and underscored the urgent need to confront the connections between climate change and health. The opening lines of the document read, quote, "We express our grave concern about the negative impacts of climate change on health. We stress the importance of addressing the interactions between climate change and human health and well-being." Unquote. In order to pursue these aims, the declaration commits to two things. One, integrating health considerations into climate policy processes, such as those under the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention, with a view to minimizing adverse effects on public health. Specific examples here would be that in designing, for example, the next round of NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, or the NAPs, which are the national adaptation plans, health considerations need to be kept in mind or need to be factored in. Second, mainstreaming climate considerations across the health policy agenda and the health work programs, including those of the World Health Organization. So if we take an India-specific example of an attempt to address this interface, the Ministry for Health and Family Welfare has launched the National Program for Climate Change and Human Health, where they are exactly trying to create awareness and to capacity build and to create research to essentially fill the gaps in the context of this particular interface. So having established this interface as a reality, one way to look at it is that you say that any climate law or policy that reduces carbon emissions or helps society adapt to climate risks, in turn automatically contributes to avoiding the negative health impacts of climate change. The other way to deal with this is to use a focus on health impact as a basis for action. And this could be either as a reasoning for climate negotiations or regulations or policy making, or for grounds for climate litigation. This brings me to the discussion on how health considerations have come to play a central role in climate litigation. And this is part two of my discussion. Now, perhaps because of the meager and low impact outcomes of climate negotiations and policies, the trend in climate litigation, I was beginning the discussion on the second part, which was to do with climate litigation. And because there was not enough outcome relating to climate negotiations or policy making, climate litigation has witnessed an upswing globally. So as of June 2025, there are over 3,000 climate-related cases. There is an exact figure which the Global Climate Litigation Report published by the UNEP gives you. These are cases filed in 55 national jurisdictions and 24 international or regional courts, tribunals, or quasi-judicial bodies. UNEP's latest report, which was published last year on the state of climate litigation, is titled Climate Change in the Courtroom, Trends, Impacts, and Emerging Lessons, which is telling in itself as far as the contents are concerned. So in this fascinating field of climate litigation, courts are becoming the avenues for addressing the legal dimensions of climate change as the phenomena of what is called turning to the courts takes root. There have been landmark rulings, opinions by international tribunals, including by the International Court of Justice and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. The four landmark rulings, which I will just point out, I will not discuss all of them, of course. The first one, starting in May 2024, was the International Tribunal for the Law of the Seas, or ITLAS, which issued an advisory opinion declaring that anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions constitute marine pollution under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. If I'm to put it very briefly, this essentially means this was a pro-climate ruling or advisory opinion that came from the ITLAS. Then in July 2025, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights issued an advisory opinion formally recognizing the human right to a healthy climate and declaring that the duty to prevent irreversible climate harm is what international lawyers call jus cogens, or a peremptory norm of international law. In the same month, the International Court of Justice, or ICJ, delivered its widely known advisory opinion on climate change, establishing that states have a legal obligation to protect the climate system and that they can be held responsible for climate inaction. There is a fourth advisory opinion, which is incoming. In May 2025, the African Court on Human and People's Rights has received a request for an advisory opinion on state obligations regarding climate change. This will be an Africa-specific ruling based on the argument that Africa contributes the least to climate emissions but suffers the most. Besides these examples of international tribunals, there are numerous domestic courts that are increasingly having to deal with cases relating to climate change. Initially, these cases were mostly located in countries of the North, but increasingly they are also spreading to the global South countries. So let me just go back a little bit and start with a very brief discussion on the Swiss case. And the Swiss case that I picked for discussion is the Klima-Seniorinnen case, a ruling on which was given by the European Court of Human Rights 2 years ago in April 2024, in a case that was very squarely located in the climate change health interface. This case was brought by a grouping called the Klima-Seniorinnen, which translates into Senior Women for Climate Protection. These were over 2,000 Swiss women who were all above 60 and had an average age of 74 years. And the petitioners argued that extreme heat waves caused by climate change threatened their life and, more importantly, threatened their health. They argued that they suffered a disproportionate impact of extreme heat on their physical and mental well-being. They argued they were particularly vulnerable because of their age and their gender, because older women suffer the highest rate of mortality during extreme heat waves. They claimed that the climate change was a health emergency, not an environmental concern alone. And they provided detailed medical reports showing cardiovascular illnesses, showing chronic asthma, pacemakers, etc. They claimed as petitioners a violation of Article 8, which was the right to respect for private and family health, and Article 2, which was the right to life. The European Court in this instance found that Switzerland violated human rights by failing to implement sufficient climate policies and that it had failed to mitigate the impact of climate change on the lives and on the health and well-being of its citizens. This is a very significant ruling because it also applies to all the members who are signatory to the European Convention on Human Rights. And the implications now for the Swiss authorities is that they are to be supervised by the Committee of Ministers to adopt measures that will ensure compliance. The Swiss state was also ordered to pay an amount to Klima-Seniorinnen. And as I said, other convention member states will also be impacted. So this was a case that came from Europe and which really started with this argument that it is the interface with health that needs to be looked into. The second and last example is the ICJ climate advisory opinion that I mentioned earlier. This is a request that emerged from really a group of students in Vanuatu who took this forward, and this gained momentum till it reached the General Assembly, was sponsored by 130 plus countries, and reached the ICJ as the request for an advisory opinion. Now, the specific questions that were asked of the International Court of Justice in this particular ruling, in this particular request, was: one, what are the obligations of states under international law to ensure the protection of the climate system? And two, what are the legal consequences under these obligations? There was specific mention of two vulnerabilities: the small island developing states, and two, peoples and individuals of the present, but also the future generations affected by climate change. The advisory opinion came out last year, in July 2025 and unanimously affirmed the entirety of Vanuatu's submissions, recognizing climate change as an urgent and existential threat. Now, the ICJ advisory opinion did many things. It elevated 1.5 degrees Celsius from an aspirational goal to the primary temperature goal. It looked at international law in general and affirmed that the focus did not need to be limited to climate treaties. And it determined that states' discretion in formulating their NDCs is not unlimited. And therefore, due diligence was required in this process as well. But more particularly on health, this particular advisory opinion recognized that climate change causes increased heat-related illnesses and diseases and mortality. And the big sort of contribution that it makes to this interface is that it clearly links environmental protection to human rights. It emphasizes that environmental damage violates, and including, of course, climate, violates the right to life and health. So it spoke about state responsibility. It also has a detailed discussion on the protection of vulnerable groups, which is very core to the climate change discussion. There is mention of non-refoulement. That is, states will have an obligation of non-refoulement if climate conditions create a real risk of irreparable harm to life or health in an individual's home country. So the ICJ opinion then, in summary, formalizes this interface between climate change and human rights, holding states accountable for health impacts caused by climate change. So these are very, very promising avenues. What does this mean in general? It means that there is an overall strengthening of the possibilities as far as climate litigation is concerned, because once this interface is strengthened, it means that you have newer international legal instruments at hand that can be used at different levels, whether it is in the domestic courts or in the international tribunals, where you can question climate change through the lens of public health. As one analyst writes, therefore, quote, health is no longer just a co-benefit of climate action. It is a core legal concern. So the ICJ has validated this and has held that failing to address climate change is essentially a failure to uphold the most basic rights of human beings. By placing health at the center of legal arguments, advocates can now appeal to both juridical logic and moral urgency, building a narrative that resonates with judges, policymakers, and the public alike, unquote. So this is the fascinating field. These are only two cases, but there are several more, some from our neighborhood. There are very interesting cases in South Asia, in Pakistan, that have also looked at or invoked the right to health. And a lot more is still with the courts. The rulings are awaited. The advisory opinions are awaited. So there is a lot to be seen as far as the climate change health interface is concerned in the context of climate litigation. Let me stop here, and I hope I haven't overspilled too much in terms of time. Over to you, Rahul. Thank you.
Thank you so much, madam, for this wonderful talk. I was quite interested and aware of the Klima Signorin case, because that was the time I was quite perplexed, shocked, and also positive that a person or a group could get a few million Swiss francs from the government on that case. It also made me wonder as to when could India reach that position. But however, I think we have reached the last part of today's climate change session and series. So given that this was quite an extensive and informative session, I have two questions for each of our speakers. First of all, my first question would be to our beloved Professor N. Krishnamurthy, sir. Sir, as the whole briefing of the session was on the butterfly or the bow tie model on cause and consequences, or what we say is cause and effect, how do we make an assessment, or how do we assess
what are the major risk factors affecting not just the human, but also the whole biodiversity. Because when we say something like environmental impact assessment, it is a quite a thorough document to make an assessment or its impact. But most of it in India is towards development, towards approach. But once that EIA report has been given, there is not much risk assessment of what happens after you get that dialogue. So, how do we assess that risk? What are the considerations to do? And so on. That is question number one, sir. Question number two is when we assess heat, we usually see across the land surface temperature as a measurement. How well do you think that it is the right way, or shall we go across another way or any modern techniques that we could do as a risk assessment, sir? As your thank you, sir.
Well, each of the questions you have posed deserve probably a long reply. But considering that you're probably reaching at 7 o'clock, I'll try to point my thoughts in the directions I would proceed. The first question was, it's a long question. The first question was about how risk assessment could be made in the face of so many divergent and broad factors.
Yes.
You know, it's an unfortunate thing that in India, safety has not struck the nerve of the common man. Because I opened a center in NIE, my alma mater, called the Center for Workplace Safety and Health, but it didn't have many takers, meaning everybody said safety is low priority in India. I think it will take time. We are the largest most populated nation in the world now. We have bet China if we have to count victories. That is one victory we can claim, that in population we have overtaken the most populated country. And visiting India frequently and reading about it, at least from afar, and seeing a lot of news reports, it has to seep in. And it is at 2 or 3 levels. I was invited to be an international expert on the Apex Safety Committee in India, DG Fastly, 2 years ago. And I worked for 2 years with a group to develop a completely revised Factories Act. The chairman at that time told me, Prof Krishna, it is like building a boat. If you build a boat for yourself, then you paddle it. You build a boat for others, you do your best and hand over the boat. So I understand that number one, all the 20 or whatever number states we have a say in the matter. That's the first round. Each state has its own pressures, political, social, cultural, ecological, environmental, financial. So, without going into a long discussion on how I would do it, I see the reality that in India, it takes a few to keep pushing. And I hope Mahe and this series is among them, because you have contact with the upper layers of decision making. I don't. I may be invited to deliver a talk, and after the talk, as you can see, I sent 100 invitations and I don't see any familiar name from my list. So the awareness has to be built by pushing, maybe talking to the film producers, talking to the media, making it attractive to the younger generation that there is something in it. I think my generation, of course, I have very few of my generation, I'm 94, but the next generation in the 60s and 70s don't have people who are very active, except a few of us. And then the next generation, the working generation, is too busy in the rat race. The younger generation, I understand many of them do not get jobs in the area of their studies. So what can I say? Awareness, awareness, awareness is the key. So to bring it, I think all of us has to keep talking regardless of how many attend, regardless of whether there are any rewards. But we must also, I won't say use AI because AI is a two-edged sword, but use all the means at our disposal, whether it be audio or video, 30-second videos, somehow get to the people. Money, I think there is enough money to roll around, but we must focus, redirect them, channel them into useful things, particularly. One thing is for sure, if we let the present state continue for a longer time, everybody will have to face the consequences. And I hope it's not too late. So I have not answered your question with actual suggestions, but as I said, I am concerned. Although I am out of India, I visit India, I read about India, I read a lot, I try to contribute, and it's going to be a problem. The second question is probably easier to answer. Can you repeat the second question in one sentence, sir?
Yes, sir. So, what are the newer techniques to, for example, assessment of heat? Right now, from
Okay.
we're looking at land surface temperature.
Yes.
Are there newer techniques that are there to assess not just heat, any other, sir?
Okay,
component?
I won't call them new, but I'll call them going back to the old. It's the people who suffer primarily. So I heard the second speaker talk about natural air conditioning and eco-friendly homes and so on. Go back to the green. I saw one of the auto rickshaws in Chennai have a thatched roof on top, and people were attracted to it because he could show that it was cooler inside. So the modern methods are moving too fast and they're expensive. And A is going to help, but it will muddy the waters. So my strong feeling is, let us take the mangrove growth, which I thought somebody would mention. But the erosion of the coastline is now successfully being controlled or managed or treated by the government of India by building or encouraging replanting. And once you replant for 100 meters, the ocean getting through the trunks and other impediments due to the natural vegetation does not erode so fast. Leave it to nature. Number one, don't push nature any more than we have done. In a way, step back, reading the temperature in particular, I would say the people are themselves complaining, but many who can afford have air conditioning. Of course, Singapore is a rich country. You enter a shopping center, when you get within 20 meters or 10 meters of it, you could see the cold air blasting out of the shopping centers. It can afford it, but India cannot. So people, again, the rich people must share their, I won't say their problems, but I won't say their wealth either. That smacks too much about socialism, I guess. But they should consider that when they extract water from all the villages, when they close their buildings and throw out their hot air into the outside, they're hurting a lot of people. So where do you measure this temperature? You measure it from the people, and the people will know whether it is from the land or from other reasons. So again, it was too big a question for me to answer probably in specific terms, but I hope you can sense the area I'm going into.
Absolutely, sir. I think you did convey the right message of bringing awareness to the system among the people, and I think we can definitely go ahead and relate this with our people. Thank you so much, sir. So for the next session, I believe that we have one question to Dr. Balsavar, sir.
Yes.
So now this is
Sorry,
in terms
Rahul,
of,
I'm sorry to interrupt. really happy that this happened. I'm sorry there was some issues with the connectivity, but this was one lecture I was so looking forward to, and it has absolutely been brilliant. Thank you so much. Rahul, yes, please continue with the
Yes,
question,
ma'am.
and
I
I
have
would then like to ask Professor Negi a question after
absolutely.
you. Yes,
Thank you.
but thank you very much. I really hope that people gain a lot of information from this lecture, given the expanse of the expertise that we had in the room today. It was really amazing. Thank you so much for actually coming and speaking.
Now, moving on to the question to Dr. Balsavar sir. Dr. Sir, now we have seen across the preparedness of what happened during tsunami. And I just wanted to ask one question, that are we ready for any future uh, disasters that came after tsunami? Or are we still reactive, or are we proactive? And that is question number one, sir. Question number two is, as Dr. Krishnamurthy said, that we have to leave nature to nature. Sometimes the older or the earlier systems were also using. Given this, question number two is, how important is reverse engineering or the olden systems that are more sustainable important in the current scenarios? So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I think very pertinent questions and also very challenging. I'll try to be as direct and yet kind of give a sense of the whole. By and large, and now this is not to kind of characterize our society or anything, we have to be careful here. But by and large, given the complexity of our cities, our society, the challenges with the resources that we have, I think there is a kind of tendency to be reactive because we do not understand how to prioritize the proactive. Now, if we increase the gamut of disasters or increase the gamut of, then the proactive may appear to require much more resources than we may have on hand. So I think that kind of pushes our cities, because I've been part of this urban planning process now for almost 35 years. And even as we understand that we need to be proactive, either because of resource or because of inadequate awareness, we tend to be reactive because it's reactive, the response is simpler. Let's take a simple example of, and I don't want to characterize and generalize here, I'm just giving a few snippets which are very limited in view. I'm sure there are other views. But let's assume we were involved in the Gujarat earthquake rebuilding. Now, that was a massive exercise. And we were involved in the Nagapattinam tsunami and the Chennai flood and Kerala flood. Now, each time, these processes take about sometimes 3 years, 4 years. Imagine we're actually building entire townships and cities. It's not a housing colony. If I go to buy a home and the developer will say 2.5 years for delivery of a housing colony, here we're talking entire cities. So it takes that kind of gestation time. Towards the end of the process, there is a tendency for society to believe that the next tsunami will happen 200 years later, or that the next earthquake will happen 100 years later. And that's the kind of mindset which pervades. And if that kind of mindset pervades, it's comfortable to be reactive. I'm not really trying to characterize, but I'm just saying on ground reality, that's what happens. And from governance or policy, it's because of a very acute sense of resource that um, it's by and large reactive. And even in a proactive, there will be layers from policy to a preparedness and capacity building at the ground level, which means you need your panchayats, you need the taluk, you need the corporation officers on ground prepared. So I think preparedness really comes, or the proactiveness comes now more from a process than from policy. And that's what we made as a shift, that we are attempting to shift it to process than policy, because policy remains academic, it remains in the shelves. And I think how can we embed it into normal processes? And there are several ways. And I think that's the shift we've made over the years now to see how it can become part of our daily life. It doesn't really have to be. So that's one part. Second part, taking from what Dr. Krishnamurthy said, and which was in my presentation also, many a time, and it may appear conceited or it may appear a little sarcastic. That's not the many a time when we are situated in urban places, urban uh, agglomerations, and then we go into rural or towns, there is a certain, I would say, inherent urban messiah that we become, when we go into these, we go as urban messiahs. And I found that when we went in there, and if we go in with an attitude of urban messiahs, I think we're in for a shock. And we're in for a shock because several of those communities retain, like I was just in Madurai the other day and came back, and you find several of, even in Andaman, the army had kind of invited me to Andaman, and because of the tsunami, and to kind of uh, explore the health of the tribe communities there. And frankly, the tribal communities and the communities in Andaman were very deeply aware of the tsunami. With all our early warning and all, we were not aware. They were deeply aware, and there was no loss of life. So it means that a lot of it rests in indigenous knowledge as well. I don't want to glorify indigenous knowledge or tradition or past. I don't want to do that. But at the same time, I think if we can now look at a synergy of that entire centuries and repository of knowledge that lies in the villages and towns, and I think there is much learning for us there. So this kind of, and kind of synergize it with some of the latest technologies which can provide us foresight and insight which we use today for predicting climate. So I think we were, but I think anchoring or privileging AI and or only one, or privileging ancient and saying that's our ancient tradition. I think that if we can go to the next level and look at synergies. So like I was talking about the 15-minute walking city, and we find that those cities, even in terms of health, are are uh, are commendable, because they don't not only have mixed use, they have an amazing intermix of elderly and children because of the land use, the walking. Now, in India, I can't see more than anywhere else where the word socio-economic works. So if I have to get a shirt stitched in, let's say, the medieval town, and I walk down to the tailor who is 5 minutes away, socio-economic means while the tailor is stitching and he says it's 250 rupees, I'm really having a conversation about the neighborhood. And that kind of conversation, helps in social cohesion. So I think health also comes from what is the nature of this community. How do we interact? How does it generate social cohesion? And these are the insights that we've been kind of imbuing over the last 20 or 30 years, where we see that there is a merit in that kind of but to a contemporary landing point. It's not to glorify the past and then recreate it. It's not in that mode. But I think with contemporary needs, synergize it with a sense of respect for diversity, various sections of society, and really revel in that diversity. So even in our community participation, we encourage different views. We do not request the community to come to a single view on the first day, because that's much simpler. And I think reveling through that diversity is also a very enriching process. So I hope I've more or less covered both. And that's how I would see it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Especially
you.
when you're addressing of combining two questions and also highlighting the sustainability and ancient traditions and the reverse engineering process that we usually see. So for the final and last question on to Archana
Yes.
Madam, that
Yes. So
ma'am, one second, I think we
do.
can hand over
Yep, sure.
the closure ceremony to you. So I'd just like to thank you. Yes, Archana Madam. So in terms of the dependency, I was fortunate enough to attend the virtual COP meeting. And I did see that in terms of the financial commitments that each country had to give, they had put an equal bracket for developing countries such as India also in terms of payment. Now I understand that the Paris Agreement, they were sustaining a lot of commitments given by US, and US also had backed down in between, and then again it came up. And secondly, one thing, what a first question, again, two-part question. The first question is, how do we address in the international court when powerful countries like US back down on its commitment? That is the first country, and what are the ways ahead? Now, for the second part of the question is, most of the US and European countries have their factories set up in countries like China and India, which of course, in one side, it reduces their carbon emission from a developing country, but from a developed country, the carbon emission is down, but developing country, the carbon emission is much higher. While at the same time, near impossible targets are given to India, like reduce fossil fuel or etc. And of course, after discussion, it is improve coal. So what are the policy that would come across to address? How would, as the policy and the diplomacy or advocacy, how would one look to address these two questions? Thank you, sir.
Well, I understand the first question is on finance, and finance has been one of the big failures in the climate negotiations. So, as we followed what happened in Baku, and particularly what India's position was and how the walkouts happened on finance, the bottom line in climate finance is that the obligations that are felt by the poorer countries, by the developing countries, do not have a parallel financing coming in. And that linkage was something which, right in the beginning in 1992, when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was being drafted, that was something that India had taken on the table. That we are on board, provided, and that linkage was to do with transfer of technology, it was to do with finances. But that has never, so many, the funds have been set up, etc., but it's more or less been like having an empty uh, good luck, as you call it in Hindi, a money box, but with very little money in it, especially not enough to meet the kind of obligations there are. In the context of obligations that developing countries have, as you mentioned, if you remember the Kyoto Protocol, they had these flexibility mechanisms which particularly looked at ways in which, so you had carbon trading, you had the clean development mechanism where developing countries could come in. But the real issue or concern, which is not just limited to climate, but also to other issues like water, is when you are exporting your pollution, right? So you're saying, I'm not going to be doing this, a climate adverse activity within my borders, but I'm going to let you do it, and then you export what I need to meet. And this has, of course, been a concern. This is a very, very complex issue. Perhaps it's going to take far too long to go into the nitty-gritty of it, but this is certainly very, very core, to the negotiations. One last line on, so one aspect that I, work on closely in my research is to do with sustainability standards. And a lot of these issues come up there as well, because the nature of production has changed. We used to have a global trade where a product was produced in country A and then crossed a border and exported to country B. Now you have these global value chains, and how do you then ensure that production is clean, is environmentally sustainable, or is climate friendly, etc. So this is a whole new, area that is being looked into. The European Union has started with its, there is the CBAM legislation, there is the EUDR, etc. There are at least 3 new legislations which are now being experimented with, basically to see how sustainability and climate friendliness can be induced in production, in value chains, which is not to say that the older concerns of the developing countries continue, which is that many of these standards end up being barriers to trade and make trade that much more difficult for the poorer countries. So it's all on the table, and thanks for bringing both the issues on the table, both finance and this sort of north-south divide which continues.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this question. Now I hand over the platform to Dr. Swati Shuri, the OG original moderator of today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul. Really appreciate what you all said. As I said previously, the reason I specifically wanted, Professor Krishna, you really explained what the issues are with the divide across the different countries. Sadly, 100 years later, it still continues in different phases. Mr. Durganand Balsavar, thank you so much for really explaining what is happening on the ground, because very often people are unaware of what is happening on the ground, and the fact that we can make changes, small changes, big changes. The changes you spoke about are of course very large, but I think it's true, we do need to make smaller changes. And thank you, Dr. Negi, for bringing actually what happens behind the scenes, like what are the negotiations that happen. And I really am so glad that you all accepted my invitation to speak today. Thank you, Rahul and Elisa, for managing. Sometimes online is great because we can get together and discuss. I do have a lot of other questions, which I think I will take offline with each one of you. I think it's true that, not it's true. I'm happy that health is no longer a co-beneficiary, but actually the main aspect of climate change. It's also very important that we are able to explain to the next generation that climate change is going to impact everyone, regardless of whether they are on a career cycle or they are not, it is going to. And to look out for the people who are more vulnerable does remain a key problem. How we will get there, I don't know, but I agree we need to keep talking about it. So I wouldn't keep everyone for long, but I will be connecting with each one of you offline for some further, discussions and further work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your welcome address. And thank you all the attendees, participants for giving us the time and opportunity. We will shortly upload today's session after edits in the YouTube channel and be sharing you the link. Thank you so much. Happy weekend.
Thank you. I will be in touch with all of you. Thank you.